Hi guys, tonight we're stepping quietly into a strange story about a man who lived behind walls the world could not see. A leader who ruled with absolute control, yet escaped into dreams made of film reels and glowing screens. This is the tale of Kim Jong-il, the dictator who loved cinema more than almost anything else in his isolated world. As we begin, we'll move slowly through the early shadows of his life, letting each detail unfold with calm clarity. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Born in the mountains of secrecy and myth, Kim Jong-il's childhood was woven from stories crafted to shape him into something larger than life. North Korean propaganda claimed he was born on sacred Mount Paektu under a double rainbow, accompanied by the call of a swallow, though in reality he was born in a modest Soviet military camp. Yet from the very beginning, the myths mattered more than the truth. These stories were not just tales for the public. They became part of the air he breathed, part of the identity he was expected to carry. As he grew older, he moved through corridors filled with portraits, slogans, and expectations, slowly learning that his life would never truly belong to him. Even as a young boy, he found a kind of escape in the dark quiet of movie theatres specially prepared for the ruling family. There, surrounded by the aroma of old film stock, the gentle flicker of light, and the hush of carefully selected audiences, he felt something different, something like freedom. Films became his doorway to other worlds, places where he could imagine lives far beyond the rigid structure around him. By the time he was a teenager, he had already begun collecting movies obsessively, studying them with the intensity other boys reserve for sports or friends. He memorized dialogue, analyzed scenes, and imagined how he might have directed them differently. In a country that kept its borders closed and its culture tightly controlled, cinema offered glimpses of emotions and possibilities he rarely saw elsewhere. It was a quiet passion, one that grew in the shadows, waiting for the moment when he would have enough power to shape an entire nation according to the images he adored. For now, though, he remained a boy raised by a revolution, walking the narrow path laid out for him, clinging to the one thing that felt like his own, the glow of a screen in a darkened room. As Kim Jong-il moved into early adulthood, his world became a maze of responsibilities, expectations, and carefully managed appearances. Yet through all of it, his fascination with cinema only deepened, becoming a kind of personal sanctuary in a life where every word and gesture was monitored. While studying at Kim Il-sung University, he explored a wide range of subjects, but nothing captured him quite like the arts. He immersed himself in texts about film theory, foreign directors, and the emotional architecture of storytelling. Professors later recalled that he had an unusual focus, often analysing a single scene for hours, quietly peeling apart its structure like someone trying to understand the inner mechanisms of a delicate machine. The North Korean system around him, rigid and austere, had little room for the kind of creative freedom he admired in global cinema. Yet he found ways to absorb it anyway, collecting foreign movies through restricted state channels and studying them in secret screenings. With each film he watched, he became more convinced that cinema was not simply entertainment. It was a tool, a powerful medium capable of shaping emotion, shaping belief, and shaping entire populations. This idea sank deep into him, becoming a philosophy he would later apply on a national scale. As he entered his 20s, he also began working quietly inside the propaganda and agitation department, a place where art and politics intertwined. He watched how messages were crafted, how images were chosen, and how stories were deliberately shaped to influence thought. In many ways, this department became the bridge between his private passion and his future public power. Though he was still young, he became known for his meticulous eye. He would walk into a room, view a production draft for only a few minutes, and begin pointing out adjustments in pacing, framing, and symbolism. Those around him quickly learned that he took these matters seriously, almost reverently. Meanwhile, his personal film collection grew into something extraordinary. eventually reaching tens of thousands of titles stored in underground vaults and special viewing rooms, though at this early stage it was still just a growing archive of comfort and fascination. Tucked away from the outside world, he continued his late-night screenings, sometimes watching the same movie repeatedly, until he could anticipate each cut and line of dialogue with precision. His preference leaned toward grand epics, melodramas, and films that portrayed unwavering loyalty or sacrifice, themes that resonated with his upbringing in a system built on devotion and control. Yet beneath this intense focus on art, there lingered a quieter truth. He found in movies something that North Korean life rarely offered: emotion unguarded, characters who could express longing, fear, joy, or doubt without consequence. It was a small escape, perhaps the only one he truly allowed himself. And as the years moved forward, that escape would soon evolve into one of the defining forces behind his leadership, guiding decisions no one could have predicted, and shaping the cultural identity of an entire nation through the lens of his cinematic dreams. As Kim Jong-il stepped deeper into the machinery of North Korea's political system during his late 20s and early 30s, his connection to cinema transformed from a private passion into an instrument of influence that he carefully nurtured. While most young officials were preoccupied with proving loyalty through rigid ideological work, he devoted countless hours to studying film production, poring over material about lighting, editing, and performance techniques that were almost impossible to access in his country. His position as the leader's son gave him rare privileges, and he used them to secure screenings of foreign films that would never be shown to the public. Inside heavily guarded projection rooms, he would sit surrounded by notebooks, pausing scenes to take precise notes on camera angles or the emotional rhythms of dialogue. Those who worked with him said he had the unusual ability to watch a film once and immediately recite large sections, analysing them like a scholar disassembling a classic text. This obsession led him to push for changes inside the propaganda apparatus, encouraging filmmakers to embrace more dynamic storytelling and to incorporate cinematic techniques he admired from abroad. It was not rebellion, it was his attempt to modernise North Korea's cultural output in a way that still aligned with state ideology. He believed that if films were more visually compelling, the people would feel deeper loyalty to the system, responding to emotional cues rather than just political directives. In meetings, he spoke softly but firmly, asking directors to create scenes that felt more alive, with richer colours, more expressive acting, and greater attention to atmosphere. Many were surprised by his detail-oriented approach. He could spend an hour discussing a single transition or the placement of a character in the frame. Though he lacked the technical training of a true filmmaker, he possessed an instinctive sense for how images shaped perception, and this instinct gave him an unusual degree of confidence. As his influence grew, he also began building personal networks within the film sector, inviting actors, directors, and writers to exclusive gatherings where he talked at length about cinematic philosophy, comparing North Korean productions to global classics. At these gatherings, he was known to be animated, even enthusiastic, a stark contrast to the reserved demeanour he projected in political environments. His guests learned quickly that the safest way to earn his favour was to show genuine interest in the movies he loved. These conversations sometimes lasted until dawn, filled with discussions about character motivation, narrative arcs, and the emotional power of music and film. For many artists, it was the only time they ever saw someone in the upper ranks of leadership speak about art with such intensity. Yet this growing cultural influence also highlighted the divide between Kim Jong-il's inner world and the strict reality outside the palace walls. While he dissected foreign films late into the night, the public saw only carefully curated local productions that emphasized obedience, sacrifice, and collective unity. He began to view cinema as a dual entity, a private source of pleasure and a public tool of persuasion. It was this duality that slowly shaped his identity, merging his personal desires with the political expectations placed upon him. To him, films were not just stories, they were a blueprint for constructing emotional landscapes within an entire population. and as he continued to rise in power, that blueprint would soon be put to use in ways no one could have anticipated, weaving together artistry and authority in a single, tightly controlled vision of a nation. As Kim Jong-il's responsibilities expanded and he became more deeply entwined with the internal workings of the state, his influence over North Korea's entire cultural direction grew stronger, turning his long-standing fascination with cinema into a central pillar of his leadership identity. By the mid-1970s, he had already become the unofficial architect of the country's film industry, reviewing scripts, controlling storylines, and approving every major production that reached the public. He believed that films were not merely entertainment, but essential tools for shaping national consciousness, and he approached them with the intensity of someone convinced that images could mould the collective mind more effectively than speeches or policies. Directors who once worked freely within the constraints of socialist realism now found themselves expected to meet his increasingly demanding standards, with some spending weeks preparing for a single meeting where he would examine every detail of their work. He pushed them to heighten emotional expression, to create characters with clearer motivations, and to use editing in ways that guided viewers towards specific feelings, believing that emotional clarity would reinforce ideological loyalty. At the same time, he oversaw the construction of new film studios, expanding facilities, and pushing for technical improvements that allowed for more elaborate set designs, more vibrant colour grading, and enhanced sound quality. Although these upgrades were rudimentary by global standards, they represented a dramatic shift within North Korea's isolated cultural sphere. Internally, he also began appointing trusted individuals to key positions, shaping a network of loyal artists who understood his vision and recognized that their careers depended on aligning with his tastes. Despite the limitations of North Korea's closed society, he encouraged a surprising degree of experimentation within specific boundaries, sometimes approving scripts that explored personal dilemmas or subtle romantic themes, topics that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. These controlled expansions in storytelling were not signs of liberalization. They were calculated efforts to make state-approved narratives more relatable, more emotionally persuasive, and therefore more effective in reinforcing national unity. His involvement extended far beyond artistic critique. He visited sets, adjusted costumes, rearranged props, and even instructed actors on how to deliver lines with the right mixture of conviction and emotion. Some recalled that he had an uncanny ability to sense when a performer was holding back, telling them to feel with the entire body, a phrase he repeated so often that it became a quiet motto inside studio circles. For many artists, his presence brought both inspiration and immense pressure, because a single comment from him could determine the fate of an entire production. He also oversaw national film festivals, selecting winners personally and rewarding directors who best captured the ideals he wanted to promote. Over time, he developed a belief that the nation's cultural strength reflected its ideological purity, and that any weakness in storytelling signaled a weakness in spirit. In private conversations, he often compared national development to the building of a perfect scene. Everything needed to be aligned, controlled, and harmonized to create the right emotional effect. This philosophy blurred the boundaries between governance and artistry in his mind. He began to see the entire country as a kind of vast stage where he was both director and guardian, guiding millions of people not just through policy, but through carefully shaped narrative. And as his authority grew more absolute, he began pursuing far more ambitious cultural projects, convinced that cinema could elevate North Korea's global image and demonstrate its supposed artistic sophistication to the outside world. As Kim Jong-il's confidence as a cultural architect solidified, he began exploring even broader ways to reshape North Korea's artistic landscape, envisioning projects that would elevate the nation's image far beyond its borders and secure his reputation as a visionary. During this period, he initiated the creation of massive historical epics designed to rival the grand productions he admired from other countries, believing that large-scale storytelling could inspire patriotic pride and demonstrate the nation's supposed artistic depth. These films required enormous resources. thousands of extras, elaborate sets, and months of careful planning. Yet he approved each one personally, often walking through construction sites to ensure that every detail matched his expectations. He encouraged directors to embrace sweeping camera movements, dramatic landscapes, and symbolic imagery that underscored themes of collective unity, heroic struggle, and unwavering loyalty to the state. Many of these films blended elements of myth, folklore, and revolutionary history, creating narratives that felt larger than life while remaining aligned with official ideology. At the same time, Kim Jong-il commissioned operas and stage productions that mirrored his cinematic ambitions, insisting that every performance reflect a perfect harmony of music, movement, and emotion. He believed that audiences should feel transported, completely immersed in the world unfolding before them, and he often rewrote sections of scripts himself to achieve a more powerful emotional impact. This attention to detail extended to the smallest components: costume patterns, lighting cues, even the timing of an actor's breath. Those who worked under him learned to anticipate his meticulous standards, knowing that even a minor oversight could result in days of revisions. Despite the intense pressure, some artists genuinely admired the passion he brought to creative projects, noting that he possessed an intuitive grasp of visual storytelling and an almost photographic memory. Yet beneath this artistic enthusiasm lay a deeper objective. He wanted to craft a cultural identity so compelling that it would redefine how North Korea perceived itself. Films and performances were not simply meant to entertain, but to reinforce a collective narrative in which the nation was strong, virtuous, and destined for greatness. This narrative, in his view, provided emotional cohesion that traditional propaganda lacked. As he pushed these projects forward, he also developed a fascination with cinematic realism, urging crews to shoot on location whenever possible, and encouraging the construction of enormous outdoor sets that resembled entire villages or battlefields. He argued that authenticity deepened emotional impact, making fictional stories feel like reflections of lived experience. Although resources were often limited, he insisted that creativity could overcome scarcity and challenged directors to achieve excellence within the constraints of North Korea's isolation. These efforts led to a surge in national production, making cinema one of the most vibrant sectors in the country, despite its isolation from global markets. Yet, as the scale of his ambitions continued to grow, so did the demands he placed on artists and technicians, who were expected to meet standards shaped not by practicality, but by the cinematic worlds that had shaped his imagination since childhood. This period marked a turning point in his leadership, revealing how art and authority had fused in his mind into a single pursuit: the belief that a nation could be guided, shaped, and uplifted through storytelling. And as he looked ahead, he began contemplating an even more extraordinary step, one that would require reaching far beyond the borders of North Korea to fulfill his cinematic dreams. As Kim Jong-il's ambitions intensified, he began searching for ways to elevate North Korean cinema beyond the limitations of its isolated industry. Convinced that the country needed stronger artistic foundations to achieve the cinematic excellence he envisioned. By the late 1970s, he had become deeply frustrated with what he considered the stagnation of domestic film talent, believing that many local directors lacked the creativity, discipline, and technical mastery required to bring his grand visions to life. He studied foreign filmmakers, admired their techniques, and wondered how he could infuse similar sophistication into North Korea's productions without exposing the nation to outside influence. It was during this period that he became fascinated with the idea of importing knowledge rather than simply imitating it. He believed that if he could acquire skilled individuals, people who understood the emotional language of cinema on a deeper level, North Korea's artistic potential could expand rapidly, overcoming decades of cultural isolation in a single leap. His thinking grew increasingly bold as he imagined assembling a team of exceptional creators who could train local artists, improve national techniques, and transform the country into a powerful cultural force. Yet finding such individuals through normal channels was impossible. Foreigners rarely entered North Korea, and even fewer would willingly relocate there to work under its strict system. Still, Kim Jong-il felt certain that the right talent, once brought into the fold, could reshape the nation's artistic future. His mind often returned to the limitations he saw around him. Actors who performed with rigid formality, scripts that lacked emotional complexity, and directors who struggled to implement the cinematic styles he admired in foreign films. These frustrations combined with his relentless desire for improvement, creating a sense of urgency that influenced every decision he made in the cultural sphere. To him, cinema was not just an art form, but a path toward international recognition, a way for North Korea to demonstrate beauty, discipline, and sophistication to a world that saw it only through political headlines. He often imagined how a perfectly crafted North Korean film might surprise global audiences, challenging their assumptions and showcasing the nation's hidden talent. This vision became a quiet obsession, something he revisited during late-night screenings when he watched the same classics over and over, studying them with a mixture of admiration and longing. Meanwhile, within the film studios he supervised, discussions began to circulate about his growing dissatisfaction and his desire for dramatic improvement. Some believed he simply sought perfection. Others suspected that he was preparing for a major shift in cultural policy. Regardless of the whispers, everyone knew that he wanted more than what the current industry could offer. His expectations rose sharply as he demanded innovative set designs, more expressive performances, and narratives that balanced emotional depth with ideological clarity. This new level of scrutiny created tension, but also a sense of anticipation, as artists sensed that something unprecedented might be on the horizon. Indeed, Kim Jong-il was already considering a bold step that would change the future of North Korean cinema in ways none of his colleagues could imagine. It was an idea shaped by equal parts ambition, frustration, and his lifelong belief in the transformative power of storytelling. An idea that would soon take him far beyond traditional methods of cultural development and lead to one of the most unusual decisions of his leadership. As the late 1970s turned into the early 1980s, Kim Jong-il's desire to revolutionize North Korean cinema reached a point where traditional strategies no longer felt adequate, pushing him toward an extraordinary plan that reflected both his creative ambition and his increasing detachment from conventional reality. The idea forming in his mind was rooted in a simple belief. North Korean filmmakers needed guidance from someone who truly understood cinematic craftsmanship, someone with real experience in the global industry, someone capable of elevating local productions to a level he considered worthy of international admiration. For years he had studied foreign directors, taking notes on their stylistic choices, narrative structures, and use of symbolism, but now he yearned for direct influence, someone who could transfer authentic professional knowledge to his tightly controlled studios. As his frustration grew with domestic talent, he began reviewing profiles of international filmmakers, analysing their bodies of work, looking for individuals whose artistic principles aligned with his own preferences. Among the names he examined, one stood out: Shin Sang-ok, a prominent South Korean director known for emotional depth, narrative precision, and a boldness that set him apart from others in the region. Kim Jong-il admired Shin's versatility, the way he handled drama, romance, action, and symbolism in ways that resonated with audiences. Shin's films had a level of artistry that North Korean productions lacked, and Kim viewed him as someone who could serve as the creative engine behind a new era in his nation's cinema. The more he studied Shin's work, the more convinced he became that this director held the key to elevating North Korean film to the standard he envisioned. Yet there was a problem. Shin lived in South Korea, a nation politically opposed to the North and deeply integrated into the global community. There was no scenario in which Shin Sang-ok would willingly move to Pyongyang to collaborate with Kim Jong-il, no matter how noble or ambitious the artistic vision. Still, Kim found himself returning again and again to the idea, imagining how transformative it would be to bring Shin into his world. He believed Shin could train actors to express emotion more authentically, help writers develop richer character arcs and expand the visual language of North Korean cinema in ways that could captivate both domestic and foreign audiences. These thoughts occupied Kim's mind during long nights in his private screening rooms, where he replayed scenes from Shin's films until he could predict every tone shift, every moment of tension, every carefully crafted emotional beat. The more he imagined what North Korean cinema could become under Shin's guidance, the more irresistible the idea became. He began discussing possibilities with trusted officials, floating abstract concepts about acquiring foreign expertise without explaining the full scope of his intentions. Some advisors nodded politely, assuming it was another theoretical exercise, but those closest to him sensed that he was preparing to act. Kim believed that great cultural achievements required bold steps, and he felt that North Korea deserved to be recognized for more than political isolation. To him, cinema was a tool for prestige as much as propaganda, and he envisioned film festivals one day praising the artistic innovation of Pyongyang. As these aspirations intensified, he convinced himself that it was his responsibility to bring exceptional talent into the country, regardless of the obstacles. And somewhere in the quiet intersection between ambition and obsession, Kim Jong-il made the internal decision that if North Korea could not attract a world-class director through traditional means, he would simply create circumstances that ensured the outcome he wanted. As Kim Jong-il's conviction solidified and the idea of securing Shin Sang-ok took root in his mind, the line between artistic aspiration and state strategy began to blur, creating a path that only someone with his unique combination of power, isolation, and cinematic obsession could imagine. He believed that bringing Shin to North Korea would not merely improve films, but transform the nation's cultural identity, giving the world a reason to view North Korea not as a closed political system, but as a place of artistic potential. In Kim's eyes, culture was a form of diplomacy, and cinema was its most elegant expression. If Shin could create films that captured emotional nuance, dynamic storytelling, and technical sophistication, those films could travel well beyond the country's borders, offering a glimpse of a North Korea that felt mysterious, even admirable. Kim imagined international audiences surprised by the quality of these works, critics praising their craft, and film festivals recognizing Pyongyang as an unexpected but captivating source of cinema. This dream was not rooted in vanity alone, but in a genuine belief that artistic excellence could elevate national reputation. Yet the practicalities of reaching Shin remained an enormous obstacle. South Korea would never allow one of its most celebrated directors to collaborate with its northern rival, and Shin himself, known for his independence and creative freedom, would almost certainly refuse any official invitation. Kim Jong-il understood this, but instead of abandoning the idea, he began considering unconventional methods, ways of creating opportunity when none existed. He studied Shin's personal life, learning about his struggles with South Korea's changing film landscape, the censorship disputes he had faced, and the financial difficulties his studio endured. To Kim, these challenges signalled vulnerability, a potential opening that might allow North Korea to intervene. He also learned about Shin's ex-wife, actress Choi Yoon-hee, whose elegance, talent, and emotional presence on screen had made her one of the most respected performers in South Korean cinema. Kim admired her work deeply, often replaying her performances late at night and analysing the way she conveyed subtle emotion, a skill he believed North Korean actors lacked. In his mind, Choi represented not only artistic excellence, but also a symbolic key to reaching Shin himself. If she could somehow be brought into North Korea, Shin might follow, driven by concern, responsibility, or the simple pull of personal connection. The thought lingered in Kim's mind, and slowly it began shaping itself into something more concrete. He reasoned that extraordinary goals required extraordinary steps, and in the controlled world he inhabited, ethics was secondary to vision. As he weighed the possibilities, the idea that had once seemed impossible began to appear not only achievable, but necessary. Meanwhile, within North Korea, preparations for larger cultural projects continued, and Kim's closest aides noticed subtle changes in his behaviour. He grew more contemplative, more focused, as if he were planning something vast and unpredictable. His private screenings became even more frequent, and he repeatedly requested films featuring Choi Yun-hee, studying her performances with a mixture of admiration and analytical intensity. His aides assumed it was simply another phase of artistic obsession, unaware that Kim was quietly finalising the foundations of a plan that would soon reach beyond North Korea's borders. In his mind, he had already framed the narrative: a nation hungry for artistic transformation, a leader determined to elevate its cultural future, and the belief that history would ultimately vindicate his methods. What remained now was the execution, a step that would push his cinematic dreams into the realm of reality and set in motion events that would change the lives of Shin Sang-ok, Choi Yun-hee, and the entire North Korean film industry forever. As Kim Jong-il's vision sharpened and his plan settled into a firm internal resolve, events began aligning in ways that seemed almost scripted, as though his life had become the very kind of dramatic narrative he studied so obsessively in films. He learned that Choi Yun-hee, the celebrated actress whose performances he admired, was experiencing a difficult period marked by professional setbacks and personal uncertainty. Inflation, industry shifts, and disputes with South Korean authorities had placed pressure on her once thriving career, and she was travelling internationally more often, seeking opportunities that would allow her to continue working at the level she desired. To Kim, this instability was not a tragedy, but an opening, a moment when external circumstances made his extraordinary idea feel less impossible. He became convinced that if Choi could be brought to North Korea under the right conditions, Shin Sang-ok would inevitably follow, and together they could create a foundation strong enough to rebuild an entire cinematic tradition. Over weeks and months he began quietly positioning trusted agents to monitor Choi's movements, gathering information about her schedules, acquaintances, and the places she frequented. His fixation on her work deepened as he reviewed her films repeatedly, analysing her expressions, voice, and subtle emotional shifts. The more he watched, the more he believed that she possessed something essential that North Korean performers lacked: a natural emotional fluency that could elevate acting across the entire nation. He envisioned her teaching local actors how to express complex feelings without exaggeration, how to communicate depth through stillness, and how to bring authenticity into scenes that often felt overly formal. Meanwhile, Shin Sang-ok's life was unravelling in its own way. His studio faced mounting financial troubles, his creative freedom was being restricted by government censorship, and he found himself unable to make the films he truly wanted. Kim absorbed all this information with quiet satisfaction, convinced that destiny was nudging both Shin and Choi toward a moment of vulnerability that he could use to reshape them into the artistic leaders he envisioned for North Korea. Yet even as these thoughts dominated his mind, he maintained his routines, attending meetings, reviewing scripts, and continuing to supervise national cultural projects without revealing any hint of the plan forming beneath the surface. Those around him sensed only that he had become more introspective, spending long hours alone in his private screening rooms, where reels of film rotated endlessly, illuminating his face with the soft glow he had loved since childhood. Behind this calm exterior, however, he was preparing for a decisive action, one that would require precision, secrecy, and absolute confidence. He believed that extraordinary moments in history often emerge from bold decisions, and in his mind this was not an act of aggression, but a necessary step toward the cultural renaissance he envisioned. He imagined the moment when Shin and Choi, once disoriented and uncertain, would eventually understand his motives, accept their roles, and contribute their talents to what he envisioned as a new golden age of North Korean cinema. The emotional justification he constructed for himself felt almost noble. He believed he was rescuing their artistic potential from the limitations of the outside world. As he saw it, they belonged in a place where their abilities would be cherished, supported, and utilised to their fullest extent. This belief grew stronger with each passing day, solidifying into a certainty that his plan was both righteous and inevitable. And as the final pieces aligned, Kim Jong-il knew the moment had come to turn thought into action, setting off a chain of events that would alter the lives of everyone involved and mark one of the most unusual chapters in the history of global cinema. As the final stage of Kim Jong-il's plan approached, the atmosphere around him grew strangely calm, as if he were entering the quiet concentration of a director, preparing for the most important scene of his life. His confidence in the idea had matured into something close to conviction, and he saw no contradiction between his intentions and the extraordinary steps he was prepared to take. In his mind, great works of art were born from decisive action, and he believed he was simply doing what history demanded. Choi Yun-hee, meanwhile, continued travelling abroad in search of new opportunities, unaware that she was being observed with an intensity she could never have imagined. When Kim received word that she would be visiting Hong Kong for professional meetings, he recognised it as the moment he had been waiting for, a place where security was looser, distractions were plentiful, and intervention could occur discreetly. He instructed his agents to prepare carefully, emphasising the need for precision and subtlety. Everything had to unfold smoothly, without unnecessary risk or attention, as though it were a sequence from a film whose pacing needed to feel natural. He wanted no chaos, no spectacle, only controlled execution. In Pyongyang, he continued overseeing cultural affairs as though nothing unusual was happening, speaking with directors, reviewing scripts, and hosting screenings with the same calm demeanour. But inside, he monitored every update from Hong Kong, following the movements of agents like a director following the progression of a tracking shot. His belief in the necessity of this moment sustained him. He imagined the future he was constructing, a future where North Korean cinema would flourish under the guidance of artists he deeply admired. As preparations entered their final hours, Kim spent long evenings alone with films featuring Choi Yun-hee, focusing not on the plot but on the details, the shape of her gestures, the timing of her reactions, the quiet strength in her expressions. These private screenings reinforced his belief that she possessed something uniquely valuable, something he felt compelled to preserve and cultivate. He saw her not as an individual with her own life, but as an essential thread in the cultural tapestry he was determined to weave. At the same time, he thought often of Shin Sang-ok, imagining how the director would respond once he realised Choi was gone. Kim believed that Shin's dedication to her, both personally and artistically, would draw him toward North Korea, completing the pairing Kim had envisioned. He saw it less as manipulation and more as destiny, a convergence of talent, timing, and opportunity that would ultimately benefit everyone involved. As the final signal arrived indicating that Choi had been taken under controlled circumstances, Kim felt a sense of inevitability settle over him. There was no celebration, no outward emotion, only the quiet recognition that his plan had begun to unfold exactly as he had imagined. For him, it was not the climax of a story, but the opening of a new chapter, one in which his cinematic ambitions would finally take shape in the real world. He believed that history would remember this moment not for its secrecy, but for the cultural transformation it would make possible. And as he returned to his screening room that night, surrounded by the gentle hum of film reels, he felt a sense of calm certainty, aware that the next phase of his vision was already in motion. In the days following Choi Yun-hee's sudden disappearance, Kim Jong-il moved through his routines with a quiet steadiness, never revealing to those around him that a plan years in the making had entered its next stage. He continued attending cultural meetings, offering detailed feedback on scripts, and maintaining the calm posture expected of him within the political hierarchy. Yet his mind remained fixed on the unfolding developments abroad. In Hong Kong, confusion spread quickly among those who had been scheduled to meet Choi. Her absence raised concerns, but few could imagine that her situation was tied to something far more elaborate than a missed appointment. Meanwhile, in Pyongyang, preparations were already being made for her arrival. ensuring that she would be treated with a combination of respect, caution, and carefully controlled hospitality. Kim believed deeply that once she saw the scale of North Korea's film studios and the sincerity of his artistic ambitions, she would eventually understand the role he envisioned for her. He imagined her walking through sound stages, observing actors rehearsing scenes inspired by her performances, and recognizing the opportunity to shape an entire nation's cinematic identity. Though he expected initial resistance, he felt certain that time and creative purpose would gradually shift her perspective. As these thoughts filled his mind, another part of his plan began taking shape. The delicate question of how Shin Sang-ok would react once he realized Choi had vanished. Kim knew that Shin, already struggling professionally and emotionally, would be deeply alarmed, and Kim believed this emotional upheaval would lead him directly where Kim wanted him to go. He saw their connection not as something he was exploiting, but as a powerful bond that could, in his view, create a cultural revival once both individuals were in North Korea. In the weeks that followed, Shin searched desperately for answers, travelling, making calls, meeting with contacts, and confronting an ever-growing sense of dread. Kim received reports on Shin's movements, reading each one with the cool detachment of a director analysing an actor's performance in a scene built on rising tension. The inevitability of what would come next felt to Kim like the smooth progression of a narrative he had been shaping for years. In Pyongyang, crews began quietly preparing new projects, films that Kim imagined Choi might star in, productions that would be reworked under Shin's future guidance, and early drafts of scripts that reflected Kim's dream of creating cinema that blended emotional realism with ideological clarity. He walked through studio corridors, envisioning how these empty spaces would soon be filled with the energy of renewed artistic purpose. Those who observed him from a distance assumed he was simply immersed in his usual work, unaware that he was arranging his creative world like a stage set being prepared before the actors arrived. Though he did not express it openly, Kim felt a strange mixture of anticipation and calm satisfaction. He believed that destiny was aligning in his favour, merging personal ambition with what he saw as cultural necessity. In his mind, he was not orchestrating a disruption of lives, but guiding talent toward the place where it could achieve its fullest potential. As more reports arrived from abroad, Kim sensed that the moment would soon come when the next chapter of his extraordinary plan could unfold, the moment when Shin Sang-ok, driven by confusion, fear, and unanswered questions, would find himself drawn into the same path that had already brought Choi Yun-hee northward, completing the pair that Kim believed would redefine the future of North Korean cinema. As the weeks unfolded and the mystery surrounding Choi Yun-hee deepened, Kim Jong-il followed every development with quiet precision, convinced that the momentum he had set in motion would soon guide Shin Sang-ok along the path he expected. Reports showed that Shin was growing increasingly distressed, meeting with officials, questioning colleagues, and retracing Choi's steps in desperate attempts to uncover any clue about her disappearance. Kim read each update like a meticulously crafted scene summary, noting how fear, determination, and confusion intertwined in Shin's actions. To Kim, this unfolding tension was not merely a consequence of the situation, but an essential emotional build-up, the kind that would ultimately drive Shin toward a moment of irreversible change. Kim believed that emotional stakes, once raised high enough, governed human decisions more strongly than logic. Meanwhile, in Pyongyang, he ensured that preparations continued quietly for the arrival of someone he considered indispensable to North Korea's artistic future. The studios were kept spotless, new equipment was positioned for demonstrations, and trusted officials were briefed on how to welcome a guest who would not yet understand why he had been brought there. Kim's confidence in his vision remained steady. He imagined Shin stepping into the studios, observing the scale of the resources, and realizing that he was being offered something rare, a chance to create films without commercial pressure, without foreign censorship, without the constant financial instability that had plagued him in recent years. Kim genuinely believed this creative freedom would eventually appeal to him. As updates continued, Kim noticed a shift in Shin's behaviour. His movements grew more frantic, his inquiries more urgent. He cancelled professional commitments, travelled repeatedly, and expressed fear that something beyond ordinary misfortune had occurred. Each detail reinforced the emotional trajectory Kim expected, convincing him that Shin would soon reach a threshold where the unexpected would no longer shock him, only compel him forward. When Kim finally received the message that Shin had travelled to Hong Kong in person, retracing the final days before Choi vanished, Kim felt a deep sense of inevitability settle over him. The situation was moving exactly as he had anticipated, each step unfolding with the kind of narrative coherence he admired in well-crafted films. He returned to his private screening room that evening, surrounded by shelves of imported tapes and dim lighting, and watched one of Shin's older films with an intensity bordering on reverence. He paid attention not just to the scenes, but to the emotional rhythm, the way Shin balanced stillness with movement, subtlety with dramatic tension. To Kim, every directorial choice felt like confirmation that his plan was justified. He believed that Shin's artistic brilliance deserved a place where it would be protected and celebrated, and he saw North Korea as the only environment capable of offering such stability. The outside world, in Kim's view, had failed to value Shin properly, pushing him through cycles of restriction and financial difficulty. In North Korea, Kim imagined, Shin would finally be free to create without limitation. As night deepened, Kim felt the calm anticipation of a man who believed he was guiding destiny rather than manipulating events. In the days ahead, he expected the final pieces of his extraordinary plan to align, bringing Shin Sang-ok closer to Pyongyang and completing a partnership that Kim believed would become the creative core of a new era in North Korean cinema. As Shin Sang-ok stepped into Hong Kong searching for answers, unaware that every move he made was quietly observed, Kim Jong-il monitored the unfolding situation with the calm focus of someone watching a sequence he had already envisioned long ago. Reports described Shin's growing desperation as he met with acquaintances, visited familiar studios, and returned repeatedly to the last places Choi Yun-hee had been seen, hoping that some overlooked detail might reveal what had happened to her. Kim read these updates as though they were part of a script, noting how each moment of uncertainty pushed Shin further along the emotional arc that Kim believed would eventually lead him north. He understood that the uncertainty surrounding Choi's disappearance weighed heavily on Shin, deepening both fear and determination, and Kim saw this emotional pressure not as cruel misfortune, but as the driving force that would guide the director toward a destiny Kim had already mapped in his mind. In Pyongyang, Kim continued preparing for the arrival he felt increasingly certain would occur. He instructed studio staff to organize demonstration reels, have actors rehearse scenes that might appeal to Shin's taste, and ensure that the facilities appeared modern, efficient, and ready for ambitious projects. Kim believed firmly that once Shin saw the resources available, sound stages, crews, costumes, and the freedom to direct without commercial interference, he would eventually understand the opportunity being presented to him, even if the circumstances of his arrival were far from ordinary. Meanwhile, Shin's situation in Hong Kong grew increasingly uncertain. His attempts to contact authorities brought little clarity, and his meetings with colleagues yielded only speculation. The feeling that something was deeply wrong followed him everywhere, filling each day with tension. Kim received these updates with a measured sense of satisfaction, convinced that the emotional stage was being set exactly as required. He believed that when a person reached a point where confusion, fear, and longing intertwined, they became open to possibilities they might once have rejected outright. As Shin continued searching, he found himself alone more often, replaying possibilities in his mind, questioning whether Choi had left voluntarily or been caught in something far more complex. Kim's team monitored his movements as he wandered through districts, entered cafes, made phone calls, and spent long stretches staring at the harbour. In Pyongyang, Kim immersed himself in another screening of Choi's films, not out of sentimentality, but to reassure himself that his vision was justified. He watched her expressions frame by frame, imagining how she could bring depth to North Korean performances once she adapted to her new environment. He believed deeply that both she and Shin were destined to elevate his nation's art, and he saw himself as the catalyst who would bring their talents to the place where they could flourish. As Shin's frustration mounted, Kim sensed that the moment he had anticipated was approaching. The moment when Shin, overwhelmed by unanswered questions, would be vulnerable enough for circumstances to shift dramatically. Kim felt no triumph in this belief, only a quiet certainty, as though all of this had been set into motion long before the pieces began to move. And as the final reports from Hong Kong indicated that Shin had reached a point of emotional exhaustion, Kim understood that the next phase of his plan was about to unfold, drawing Shin closer to a fate he could not yet imagine, but one Kim saw as essential to the future of North Korean cinema. As Shin Sang-ok's search in Hong Kong stretched into days filled with tension and uncertainty, Kim Jong-il watched the reports with the detached concentration of someone observing a complex scene unfold exactly as he had imagined. Shin's movements became increasingly erratic as he visited police stations, questioned hotel staff, and retraced Choi Yun-hee's final documented steps again and again, hoping that persistence might somehow reveal a missing detail. Kim saw each of these movements as part of an emotional progression, the kind that deepened a character's resolve in the middle act of a film. The sense of helplessness surrounding Shin did not strike Kim as a tragedy, but as a pivotal narrative moment, one that heightened the stakes and prepared the ground for the dramatic shift he believed was inevitable. Meanwhile, Shin's career troubles continued to press on him like an invisible weight. His studio in South Korea remained in financial crisis. Creditors demanded answers, and government regulators offered little support. Kim reviewed these details and saw them not as obstacles, but as threads converging toward the outcome he sought. He believed that when professional instability collided with personal anguish, the resulting emotional storm often left a person open to change, even to possibilities they could never have imagined. As Shin continued his frantic search, Kim ensured that arrangements in Pyongyang remained carefully organized. He oversaw the preparation of a private residence where Shin could comfortably stay, instructed staff to assemble film resources that he hoped would intrigue him, and selected a small group of trusted individuals to serve as creative liaisons once Shin arrived. Kim's confidence in his vision was unwavering. He imagined Shin touring the studios, observing the scale of the sets, and recognizing the opportunity to create ambitious works without interference. To Kim, this vision felt not manipulative but purposeful, as though he were guiding two artists toward a destiny that would ultimately redefine their legacy. In Hong Kong, however, Shin's situation grew more alarming as he encountered contradictory information and unhelpful authorities. His frustration turned into suspicion as he realized that Choi's disappearance was no simple accident or personal decision. He confided in close colleagues that he feared something far more deliberate had occurred. These reports reached Pyongyang, and Kim interpreted them as signs that Shin's emotional resistance was weakening, that the final barrier between him and the fate Kim had constructed was beginning to crumble. During this time, Kim spent more hours in his screening rooms, not out of anxiety but as a form of contemplation. He watched both Shin's and Choi's older films, studying the artistic choices that had once defined South Korea's cinematic golden age. Each viewing reinforced his belief that North Korea lacked what these two artists possessed: a fluency in emotional expression, a mastery of human nuance, a sense of cinematic rhythm that Kim hoped to cultivate within his own industry. He imagined how their combined talent could reshape North Korean cinema, bringing depth, sophistication, and international credibility. He envisioned their future productions screened at foreign festivals, surprising critics with their artistry. This dream, vivid in Kim's mind, justified every step he had taken. As Shin's emotional state deteriorated and he became more isolated in his search, Kim sensed that the moment of transition was close. The next report from Hong Kong confirmed that Shin, exhausted and increasingly desperate, had agreed to meet with individuals he believed could provide new information, individuals who were, unbeknownst to him, part of the very plan that had been unfolding around him for months. Kim received this update with quiet certainty, recognizing it as the turning point in a story he felt had only one possible conclusion. As Shin Sang-ok agreed to meet the individuals offering supposed information about Choi, the final stage of Kim Jong-il's long-forming plan moved quietly into place, unfolding with a kind of deliberate stillness that mirrored the pacing of a slow, tense scene in a psychological drama. The people Shin encountered appeared sympathetic, professional and helpful, presenting themselves as contacts who might bridge the gap between rumour and truth. They asked careful questions, listened closely to his worries, and offered subtle assurances that they understood the complexity of the situation. Shin, emotionally drained and desperate for answers, followed their guidance without recognizing that the path they were outlining had been drawn long before he stepped into the room. Meanwhile in Pyongyang, Kim received each update with calm attention, treating them not as reports but as cues in a script he believed he had authored through sheer force of will. He saw Shin's cooperation not as surrender, but as the natural progression of a story built on emotional momentum. In Kim's mind, this was the convergence point where artistic destiny, political power, and personal conviction aligned. As preparations continued, he ordered the studio district to be readied for an eventual introduction, ensuring that sets, costumes, and workspaces looked active and full of promise. He wanted Shin's first impression to be one of potential, not pressure, to see a place where creativity could flourish under the right guidance. In Hong Kong, Shin's situation shifted abruptly. The meetings grew more private, the assurances more vague, and the sense of disorientation deeper. Kim monitored these developments with a quiet certainty that the transition was nearing completion. He believed that once Shin crossed the threshold into isolation, physical and emotional, his eventual acceptance of North Korea's role in his life would be less a shock and more an adaptation to circumstances that offered purpose. Within Kim's private world, the nights passed in dim screening rooms, where he replayed sequences from Shin's films, studying their pacing, structure, and emotional clarity. He admired Shin's ability to blend tension with humanity, believing that such skill could elevate North Korean productions to an entirely new level. He often imagined himself discussing ideas with Shin, exchanging interpretations of scenes, debating narrative choices, and shaping films that would resonate on an international scale. As these visions filled his mind, he felt reassured that everything he was doing served a greater cultural mission. The next message that arrived confirmed that Shin had been separated from his contacts and moved into controlled circumstances, a development that Kim had anticipated with absolute confidence. There was no triumph in his reaction, only a steady acknowledgement that the moment he had been guiding toward for years was finally taking form. He believed that once the initial shock passed, Shin would see the environment Kim had prepared not as a prison, but as a sanctuary for creative renewal. Kim's conviction rested on the assumption that artists, when given tools, attention, and stability, eventually shifted their loyalty to the place where their talents were nurtured. And as he walked through the quiet studio corridors that evening, he imagined them soon echoing with the presence of the director he had admired from afar, a man he believed would help him reshape the entire identity of North Korean cinema, even if the path that brought him there began with confusion, fear, and an irreversible step into the unknown. As the final reports from Hong Kong confirmed that Shin Sang-ok had vanished from public reach, Kim Jong-il stepped into a quiet phase of preparation, moving through Pyongyang with the controlled composure of someone who believed events were unfolding exactly as they were meant to. He did not rush the next steps or demand constant updates. Instead, he allowed the transition to proceed at its own careful pace, confident that the emotional and logistical groundwork had already been laid. In private, he reviewed the arrangements made for Shin's eventual arrival: comfortable living quarters, access to curated libraries of films, and a small team of intermediaries who would help introduce him to the environment without overwhelming him. Kim believed deeply that the first impression needed to be one of safety and potential, not confinement. He wanted Shin to feel disoriented, yes, but not hopeless, unsettled, but not broken, uncertain, yet still capable of finding meaning in what lay ahead. In his mind, this delicate balance was essential for allowing an artist to shift from fear to acceptance. Meanwhile, Shin's disappearance sent ripples through those who knew him. Friends and colleagues speculated wildly, some fearing criminal activity, others imagining he had left voluntarily under pressure from debts or career issues. These uncertainties reached Kim, and he absorbed them with the detached curiosity of someone watching the world interpret a story without knowing its author. He believed that the confusion abroad would eventually fade, dismissed as an unsolved mystery rather than a political incident. Inside North Korea, staff continued to rehearse scenes, refine sets, and maintain the appearance of normal production. The atmosphere inside the studios felt strangely expectant, as though everyone sensed that something significant was about to change, but did not yet understand how. Kim visited the main soundstage at dusk, walking quietly through the empty space, imagining how Shin might one day stand there, studying camera angles, instructing actors, and reshaping performances with the same confidence he once brought to his South Korean films. Kim saw this vision so clearly that it felt almost real, as though the future were playing out in front of him through the soft echoes of his own footsteps across the floor. During these days, he spent long hours in his private archive selecting a range of films he believed would appeal to Shin. Classics from Europe, emotional dramas from Japan, and even a few Hollywood productions he had acquired through discreet channels. He instructed aides to prepare these tapes for immediate access, convinced that presenting Shin with familiar cinematic language would create a bridge between fear and creative possibility. Kim reasoned that an artist deprived of stability would eventually cling to the one constant that had always grounded him, the art itself, and Kim intended to provide that constant generously. As the date of Shin's arrival grew closer, Kim took care to remain outwardly composed, not altering his daily schedule or allowing any sign of anticipation to show. His colleagues and political companions saw only the same calm leader, overseeing cultural affairs with meticulous attention. But beneath this composed exterior lay a quiet sense of inevitability, the feeling that a new chapter in North Korean cinema was about to begin. Kim believed that once Shin adapted to his surroundings, once the shock faded and the creative environment took hold, he would no longer see North Korea as a place of captivity, but as a studio unlike any he had ever known, one where he could build grand narratives, guide performers, and shape stories with the full support of a leader who valued his genius. And as Kim prepared for the moment when their paths would finally cross, he felt no doubt, no hesitation, only the steady confidence of someone who believed he was fulfilling a destiny written not in politics, but in the quiet flicker of film reels that had illuminated his life since childhood. As the day of Shin Sang-ok's transfer drew nearer, Kim Jong-il watched the preparations with a calm certainty, convinced that everything was aligning exactly as a well-paced narrative should. He had never believed that destiny moved in abrupt leaps. Instead, he imagined it unfolding like a slow, deliberate tracking shot, revealing each detail at the precise moment it was meant to appear. In Pyongyang, the residence prepared for Shin was quietly stocked with small comforts, films, writing materials, carefully arranged furnishings, chosen not to overwhelm him, but to create a sense of quiet stability once the shock of arrival faded. Kim emphasized that fear alone could not build loyalty. An artist needed the feeling of being valued, of being recognized, even if the path leading him there had been unconventional. Meanwhile, Kim received continued updates about the reactions abroad to Shin's disappearance. The confusion, the speculation, the conflicting stories, all of it unfolded exactly as Kim had predicted. Without evidence, authorities struggled to form a narrative, and the absence of clarity made the situation easier to dismiss. Kim believed that within weeks the world would move on, leaving the mystery behind as one more unresolved thread in a region accustomed to uncertainty. Inside North Korea, however, the anticipation grew quieter and heavier. A few trusted aides, aware that something important was coming, made subtle adjustments to schedules and security measures. The film studios continued running routine projects, though many sensed that a silent shift approached, like the atmosphere before a director calls action on an unannounced scene. Kim visited the main production facilities at night, where dim lights reflected off metal rails and empty sets stood waiting for purpose. He walked through the silent spaces, imagining Shin's footsteps echoing alongside his own, imagining conversations about framing and pacing, imagining the beginning of a new creative era shaped by two men who, in Kim's mind, shared a deep love for the emotional language of cinema. During these late visits, Kim often paused at the entrance of the largest soundstage, picturing the moment when he would show it to Shin. He believed the scale alone would stir something in the director, a recognition of potential, a reminder of the power of imagination. Kim convinced himself that even the most reluctant artist, once given access to tools and opportunity, would eventually lean toward creation rather than resistance. As the final confirmation arrived that Shin was en route under controlled circumstances, Kim maintained his outward composure, never revealing his anticipation to those around him. Instead, he moved through his routines, script reviews, cultural meetings, quiet screenings, while his inner thoughts circled around the image of a director awakening in a new environment, unsure of the path ahead but unable to deny the spark of curiosity that Kim hoped would eventually take root. To Kim, this was not the culmination of a plan but the true beginning, the moment when two artistic worlds would collide and, in his mind, merge into something greater. And as night settled over Pyongyang, he allowed himself one final moment of reflection, convinced that when Shin opened his eyes in North Korea, the story he had dreamed for years would finally begin to take shape, not through force, but through the irresistible pull of creative purpose, waiting patiently in the quiet glow of the studios he had crafted with obsessive care. As Shin Sang-ok finally approached North Korea under circumstances he could neither anticipate nor understand, Kim Jong-il prepared himself with the quiet focus of someone awaiting the arrival of a long-studied character, stepping into the next act of a carefully crafted story. He maintained his routine with deliberate steadiness, refusing to reveal even the slightest shift in demeanour to those around him, yet inside his thoughts were fixed entirely on the moment when Shin would awaken, in a place that seemed both foreign and strangely intentional. Kim believed the transition needed to unfold like the opening sequence of a film, confusing at first, unsettling, but threaded with small details that hinted at a deeper purpose waiting to be understood. In preparation, he instructed a select group of aides to be gentle but firm, to offer no explanations beyond what was necessary, and to provide calm reassurance without revealing the full scale of the environment awaiting Shin. Kim reasoned that clarity given too soon might overwhelm him, while carefully measured exposure would allow curiosity to rise naturally. Curiosity, Kim believed, was an artist's strongest instinct, capable of bridging even the most unexpected distances. Meanwhile, he oversaw the final adjustments to the residence prepared for Shin, a place designed to be neither luxurious nor austere, but balanced, steady, and quietly comfortable. Kim chose items with symbolic intention: film journals he admired, equipment manuals, notebooks placed on a desk in a well-lit corner, and a small collection of classic films he thought might evoke familiarity amid disorientation. Each object in his mind served as an invitation rather than an explanation. Within the studios, Kim's trusted staff continued rehearsing scenes and maintaining facilities with a renewed sense of diligence, even if they did not fully understand why. Kim walked the studio grounds at twilight, absorbing the silence, imagining how Shin might interpret each detail: the scale of the backlots, the carefully maintained sets, the stacks of storyboards pinned neatly in offices waiting for direction. He believed that an artist of Shin's caliber once past the initial shock, would inevitably feel drawn toward these spaces the way a musician gravitates toward an untouched instrument. When he received the message confirming Shin's arrival in North Korea, Kim paused only briefly, allowing the moment to settle before returning to the calm rhythm of his day. He felt no triumph, only a deep certainty that the next phase of his vision had begun. He knew Shin would awaken confused, perhaps frightened, but Kim trusted that time, stability, and the quiet presence of creative opportunity would gradually shift the emotional landscape. He had observed countless artists over the years and believed that the desire to create could outgrow almost any resistance once given the space to breathe. That night, Kim retreated to his private screening room and chose one of Shin's earlier films, one he had studied dozens of times. As the scenes unfolded, he imagined how he would one day speak with the director about the framing choices, the tonal balance, the quiet emotional threads woven into the story. To Kim, these thoughts were not fantasies, but inevitabilities, moments he believed would arrive naturally when the initial turbulence faded. And as the film's final shot lingered on the screen, Kim felt a quiet conviction settle over him. The story he had constructed piece by piece was finally entering its most delicate and meaningful phase, the one in which a director and a leader, shaped by obsession, ambition, and the language of cinema, would finally occupy the same frame. As Shin Sang-ok awakened in North Korea, surrounded by unfamiliar walls and a silence unlike anything he had ever known, Kim Jong-il followed the reports with the same steady concentration he brought to his late-night film analyses. He understood that the disorientation would be overwhelming at first, a blur of questions without answers, and he believed that it was essential for this phase to unfold slowly, without confrontation or haste. Shin's caretakers were instructed to remain calm, offer food and warmth, and gently reassure him without providing explanations that might spark resistance too early. Kim was certain that an artist thrust into isolation would initially cling to fear, but he believed just as firmly that fear would eventually give way to introspection, and introspection to curiosity, a progression Kim thought of as a universal pattern, one he had observed countless times in the emotional arcs of his favourite films. While Shin struggled to understand his situation, Kim spent the days refining his own approach to their eventual meeting, rehearsing conversations in his head with the same precision he used when adjusting a film's pacing. He imagined beginning with shared artistic language, referencing scenes from Shin's work, subtle moments of symbolism or emotional nuance that only a true admirer would notice. Kim believed that recognizing such intimate details would demonstrate respect and signal to Shin that he was not being approached as a political captive, but as a valued creator. Meanwhile, Shin's caretakers reported moments of restlessness, confusion, and quiet anger, reactions Kim had anticipated and accepted. He instructed them to introduce small elements of normalcy, a window open to let in fresh air, warm tea placed within reach, and eventually carefully selected films made accessible without explanation. Kim believed that the sight of familiar cinematic language, images, rhythms, emotional beats, would begin to ground Shin's thoughts, reminding him of the one constant that had carried him through every phase of his life. At the studios, Kim reviewed ongoing projects with heightened attention, imagining how each could one day benefit from Shin's guidance. He walked through unfinished sets, touching fabric swatches, examining props, and adjusting lighting angles as if preparing a space specifically for the director's eventual involvement. Although the staff around him remained unaware of the full context, they sensed that Kim was shaping the environment with unusual care. During evening hours, Kim returned to his private archive, studying both Shin's films and North Korea's existing productions, comparing their tone, pacing, and emotional depth. He paid close attention to weaknesses he hoped Shin would eventually help overcome: stiffness in performance, overly literal storytelling, and a lack of dynamic framing. The contrast only deepened his belief that North Korean cinema needed an outside influence to evolve. For Kim, this wasn't merely a desire but an obligation he felt toward the future of the country's artistic identity. As Shin slowly regained strength, aides reported moments when he sat quietly, staring at the floor or the window, no longer demanding immediate answers, but instead sinking into thought. Kim interpreted this shift as the first sign that Shin's mind was adjusting, processing, and searching for meaning. He believed that once the initial shock faded, the environment he'd created, carefully controlled, unexpectedly gentle, and steadily infused with artistic stimuli, would draw out the director's natural inclination to create. And as night settled over Pyongyang, Kim felt a steady conviction that the next phase was near. Not confrontation, but introduction. A meeting he imagined unfolding with the quiet gravity of a pivotal scene in a film where two characters, shaped by vastly different worlds, finally step into the same frame for the first time. As the first days of Shin Sang-ok's confinement settled into a quiet, unsettling rhythm, Kim Jong-il observed each update with the composed patience of someone waiting for the precise moment to introduce the next scene in a long, carefully paced narrative. Reports indicated that Shin had stopped demanding explanations and instead drifted into long stretches of silence, his energy focused inward as he tried to make sense of the situation. Kim viewed this shift not as resignation, but as the natural aftermath of confusion, a pause between emotional beats when the mind begins searching for structure. He believed that artists, more than others, responded to isolation by retreating into memory, imagination, and reflection, and he expected these forces to soften the edges of Shin's resistance. In preparation for their eventual meeting, Kim directed aides to place a curated selection of films near Shin's room, not forcefully but casually, allowing him to encounter them when he felt ready. Among them were several of his own works, pieces Kim admired for their emotional tone and craftsmanship. Kim reasoned that seeing familiar visual language might anchor Shin, reminding him of who he was and awakening the creative instincts that fear had temporarily overshadowed. Meanwhile, Kim continued his own routine, reviewing cultural projects with meticulous attention, though his thoughts often drifted toward the moment they would finally speak. He envisioned beginning gently, acknowledging Shin's confusion, and offering reassurance in a tone closer to admiration than authority. Kim planned to speak not as a political leader, but as a fellow lover of cinema, someone who understood the emotional architecture of storytelling, and saw in Shin a partner capable of achieving new artistic heights. At night, he walked through the studio grounds, imagining how he would present them to Shin, slowly, thoughtfully, revealing each space like a director revealing the world of a film one scene at a time. He hoped that the sets, workshops, and sound stages would evoke recognition of the creative language that transcended their circumstances. Staff who worked nearby noticed Kim's quiet intensity, but did not grasp its cause. They simply felt that he was moving with a deeper sense of purpose than usual. As Shin's behaviour stabilized, he began pacing slowly through his quarters, examining details, occasionally pausing at the sight of the films left for him. Aides reported that he picked up one cassette, turned it in his hands, then set it down without watching it. Kim received this update with the calm satisfaction of someone who believed that small hesitations often mark the beginning of reawakening. He expected that curiosity, once sparked even briefly, would grow into something stronger. By the end of the week, Shin had begun eating regularly and sleeping more soundly, signs Kim interpreted as emotional grounding. The moment he had been waiting for, a moment of fragile balance between resistance and possibility, was approaching. Kim believed that timing was crucial. A meeting too early might push Shin further into fear, but a meeting too late might allow resentment to harden. And so, as evening settled over Pyongyang, Kim made a quiet decision. The next stage would begin soon. The introduction would not be grand or theatrical, but simple. A calm conversation in a controlled setting, where two men shaped by cinema would sit across from one another for the first time. To Kim, this was not merely the convergence of plans, but the beginning of a chapter he had envisioned for years, one in which he believed Shin would eventually recognize not imprisonment, but purpose. As the days settled into a steady rhythm, Kim Jong-il sensed that the emotional landscape around Shin Sang-ok had shifted just enough for the next step to unfold without forcing tension to rise. Reports describe Shin as quieter, more observant, less reactive, no longer demanding explanations, but instead taking in his surroundings with the wary focus of someone trying to reconstruct reality piece by piece. Kim interpreted these signs with the precision of a director analysing an actor's performance, seeing in Shin's silence not defeat, but a kind of introspective suspension, the moment in a story when a character pauses before confronting a new truth. Believing that the time for their first meeting was approaching, Kim instructed his staff to prepare a small, neutral room. Not ornate, not political, simply calm. He wanted the environment to feel intentional, almost cinematic, with soft lighting, simple seating, and no symbols that might trigger defensiveness. In his mind, the meeting needed to feel like a conversation between two people who understood the language of art, not a confrontation between captor and captive. Meanwhile, Shin was gradually drawn toward the items left in his quarters. Aides noted that he had finally picked up one of the tapes again, holding it longer this time, as though weighing whether to watch it. Though he set it down once more, Kim saw this hesitation as a meaningful shift, a quiet curiosity beginning to rise through the fog of uncertainty. Kim believed that curiosity was the most powerful bridge between fear and understanding, especially for an artist whose life had always revolved around stories. In preparation for the meeting, Kim reviewed Shin's biography and filmography once more, not because he needed the information, but because he wanted every detail fresh in his mind. He planned to reference specific scenes, subtle choices in framing, moments that only a devoted admirer could recognize. Kim believed that showing this depth of attention would immediately shift the tone of the encounter, demonstrating that he saw Shin not as a prisoner, but as a creative force, someone he had valued long before their paths converged. At the studios, Kim oversaw rehearsals with unusual gentleness, knowing that soon he might walk these halls with Shin beside him, pointing out areas where he hoped the director would one day work. Staff sensed a quiet anticipation in the air, though none knew why. The sound stages, lit only by scattered work lamps, felt like sleeping spaces waiting for someone to wake them. As the final preparations were completed, Kim spent one more evening in his private screening room, watching scenes from Shin's earlier films and imagining how their conversation would begin. He rehearsed lines softly to himself, testing different tones, warm, reflective, respectful, seeking the balance between authority and admiration. For Kim, the upcoming meeting held a personal weight. He believed he was about to speak with someone who understood him more deeply than most people in his political circle ever could. When the final report confirmed that Shin was stable, calm, and physically rested, Kim made his decision. The meeting would take place the following day. It would be brief, gentle, and grounded not in explanation but in shared artistic language. As night settled over Pyongyang, Kim felt a quiet certainty deepen within him. The moment he had imagined for years, a moment shaped by obsession, preparation, and an unwavering belief in the power of cinema, was finally ready to unfold, one steady breath at a time. On the morning chosen for their first meeting, Kim Jong-il moved through his routine with an unusual calmness, as though each step of the day were guided by an invisible rhythm he had rehearsed many times before. He received updates about Shin Sang-ok's condition, still cautious, still guarded, but steady enough for a controlled encounter, and he interpreted these details with the same care he used when evaluating the emotional pacing of a film. Kim believed firmly that the meeting needed to unfold with deliberate gentleness, not as a revelation, but as a quiet shift in atmosphere. He knew that Shin would enter the room full of apprehension, and his goal was to replace that fear with curiosity, to let the first words between them settle softly rather than striking sharply. The room had been arranged exactly as Kim requested. Neutral tones, dim but warm lighting, 2 chairs placed at an equal distance, and a small table with nothing on it. There were no posters, No political symbols, nothing that suggested authority, only the feeling of a private conversation waiting to begin. When Shin was brought to the door, he hesitated, scanning the space with guarded uncertainty. Kim watched from inside, noting the tension in his posture, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way he instinctively analysed his surroundings. To Kim, this reaction was familiar. It reminded him of characters in films who stepped unknowingly into pivotal moments. He greeted Shin not with commands or explanations, but with a soft acknowledgement, speaking his name as though welcoming an old colleague. Shin did not respond immediately, but he entered the room. Kim gestured for him to sit, keeping his tone steady and unthreatening. He began the conversation not by addressing the circumstances, but by referencing a specific scene from one of Shin's earlier films, an emotional moment in which a character's silent hesitation carried more weight than dialogue. Kim described the framing, the lighting, the subtle shift in expression that defined the scene. The comment caught Shin off guard. Confusion momentarily pushed aside fear as he processed the fact that the man before him had not only watched his films but studied them deeply. Kim continued gently, discussing the symbolism in one of Shin's less mainstream works, highlighting choices that only a dedicated admirer could notice. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension in the room shifted. Shin did not relax, but his focus changed. The sharpness in his eyes softened into something more contemplative. Kim knew this shift well, the moment when an artist recognizes genuine understanding. He allowed silence to linger before speaking again, telling Shin that he admired his ability to balance emotional depth with visual subtlety. Still, he offered no explanations, no demands, only acknowledgement of artistic merit. For Kim, this first meeting was never meant to resolve anything. It existed simply to plant a seed, to establish that between them there was a shared language that transcended circumstance. When the meeting ended, Kim rose slowly, thanked Shin for his time, and left the room without waiting for a response. He did not expect gratitude or acceptance, only thought. As he walked back through the quiet halls of the residence, Kim felt a calm certainty settle over him. The moment he had envisioned for years had finally occurred. Two lives shaped by cinema had crossed paths, not in confrontation, but in the soft quiet of understanding beginning to take form. To Kim, it was the true opening shot of the future he had long imagined. In the hours after their first meeting, Shin Sang-ok sat alone in the quiet room he had been returned to, replaying every detail of the encounter with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. The calmness of the man he had just spoken with, the unexpected familiarity with his work, the absence of threats, all of it formed a contradiction he could neither categorize nor ignore. He did not understand the purpose of the conversation, nor the intentions behind the subtle praise he had heard, yet something about the interaction lingered in his mind like an unresolved chord. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-il reflected on the moment with a steady, controlled satisfaction. He believed the meeting had achieved precisely what it needed to. Not clarity, but disruption of fear, the replacement of raw panic with contemplation. In Kim's view, the emotional centre of the conversation had landed exactly where he had aimed it, on recognition, not coercion. He knew Shin was still terrified, still unsure of his situation, but he also sensed that the director's instinctive curiosity had been stirred. Over the next few days, Kim maintained distance, careful not to overwhelm or corner him. Instead, he instructed aides to provide Shin with small elements of normalcy, slightly better meals, the chance to walk a bit farther inside the compound, moments of quiet where nothing was asked of him. Kim believed strongly that autonomy, even in small gestures, softened resistance more effectively than direct confrontation. During this time, Shin's behaviour shifted subtly. Aides reported that he spent long moments staring at the films on the shelf, occasionally touching the spines of the cassettes, though he still avoided watching them. His energy remained tense but no longer frantic. He began studying his surroundings more carefully, observing routines, listening to footsteps in the hall. These changes, however small, did not go unnoticed. Kim analysed every report with the attentive precision of someone tracking character development in a screenplay. He understood that trust could not be manufactured quickly. It had to grow at its own pace, shaped by environment and emotional recalibration. Meanwhile, Kim resumed his usual activities at the studios, though his mind remained fixed on the unfolding transformation. He met with writers, reviewed early drafts for new projects, and oversaw rehearsals, all while imagining how Shin might one day reshape these very productions. He envisioned the director guiding actors through emotional beats, adjusting the pacing of scenes, and elevating the visual language of North Korean cinema with techniques he had long admired. As days passed, Kim planned a second meeting, not as direct as the first, but more purposeful. This time he intended to bring a single film reel, a Korean production previously made under his guidance but lacking the refinement he sought. He wanted to show Shin what North Korean cinema currently was, and without saying it directly, hint at what it could become. He believed the gap between vision and reality, shown plainly, would awaken a sense of responsibility in the director. But he also knew timing was crucial. A meeting too soon might feel like pressure, too late, and the emotional momentum would fade. So Kim watched carefully for signs: calmer behaviour, longer periods of thoughtfulness, reduced resistance. Finally, one evening, he received a report that made him pause. Shin had sat for nearly an hour holding a cassette from the shelf, turning it in his hands, lost in thought. He had not watched it, yet the simple act of holding it told Kim everything he needed to know. The director's mind was moving toward the one place Kim had always expected it to return, toward film, toward the creative instinct that defined his life. And for Kim Jong-il, that was the moment he had been waiting for, the signal that the next step in their carefully paced story was ready to begin. When Kim Jong-il learned that Shin had spent nearly an hour holding the cassette without watching it, he recognized the moment as a delicate emotional turning point, the kind that signaled not acceptance but awakening, an early stirring of the instinct that defined Shin's life more than fear or confusion, the desire to create, to understand, to reconnect with the language of cinema. For Kim, this small action confirmed that the director's mind was beginning to move away from panic and toward the quiet, familiar structure of artistic thought. He decided that the time had come for their second meeting, one shaped not by admiration as before, but by subtle invitation. He selected a film reel from North Korea's archives, a project he had overseen years earlier, but never felt fully satisfied with. The film had promise, ambition in its themes, visual effort, emotional sincerity, but it lacked the polish and depth he believed Shin could provide. Kim intended to present it not as a demand, but as a question, a gentle challenge that would appeal to the director's instinct to refine and improve. Preparations for the meeting were understated. The same neutral room was chosen, though this time a projector was placed quietly in the corner, its presence unspoken. When Shin entered, he appeared steadier than before, though still cautious. Kim greeted him the same way, soft voice, no pressure, no explanations. After a brief silence, Kim mentioned the film reel beside him and asked if Shin would watch just a few minutes, not for judgment, but simply for perspective. His tone was careful, almost humble, as though he were asking for guidance rather than offering direction. Shin hesitated, but something in his expression shifted. Perhaps curiosity finally outweighed uncertainty. He gave a small nod. Kim remained silent as the footage began to play. The scenes were uneven, well-intentioned but flawed, with performances that felt stiff and pacing that faltered. Shin watched intently, his brow tightening, his gaze sharpening as instinct took over. For the first time since his arrival, he seemed fully present, analysing the work not as a captive but as a filmmaker. Kim noticed immediately. He watched Shin, not the screen, noting every micro-reaction, the subtle exhale at a weak transition, the narrowing of his eyes during an emotional beat that didn't land. Kim let the reel play only a short while before stopping it gently. He asked no direct questions, only whether Shin saw potential in the production. Shin didn't answer right away, but his silence carried a different weight now. It wasn't fear or refusal, it was thought. Deep, technical, instinctive thought. Kim recognized it instantly and resisted the impulse to push further. Instead, he thanked Shin for watching and ended the meeting as calmly as he'd begun it, leaving the director alone with the projector still warm from use. As Kim walked back through the quiet corridors, he felt a steady certainty strengthen within him. He believed that the film had spoken more clearly than any words could, showing Shin a path, not forcing one. He knew the director would replay the images in his mind, thinking of adjustments, imagining improvements, unable to silence the inner momentum that had guided his entire career. To Kim, this was the moment when the story shifted once again, not through pressure, but through the irresistible pull of creative instinct sang reawakening in the silence of a foreign place. In the days following the second meeting, something subtle but unmistakable shifted in Shin Sang-ok's behaviour, a quiet recalibration that Kim Jong-il registered immediately through the steady stream of reports delivered to him each morning. Shin no longer sat in long stretches of vacant silence. Instead, he moved with a kind of inward focus, pacing slowly, pausing often, as though replaying the brief film screening in his mind. Aides noted that he hovered near the projector more than once, touching its controls without turning it on, his fingers lingering as if testing the possibility of choice. For Kim, these small observations carried immense significance. He believed that creative instinct, once reawakened even slightly, had its own momentum, and he sensed that Shin was losing the tight grip he had held around his fear. Though the uncertainty of his circumstances remained, the part of him shaped by decades of filmmaking, the part that sought rhythm, structure, and emotional coherence, was resurfacing. Kim allowed this shift to unfold without interference. He instructed aides to keep distance, to avoid unnecessary questions, and to give Shin enough solitude for thought to deepen. Kim knew from experience that some of the most important artistic decisions emerge not from dialogue but from silence, from the slow unwinding of inattention. Meanwhile, Kim resumed his daily work, overseeing cultural reviews and refining plans for projects he hoped Shin would one day direct. He walked through the back lots imagining how Shin might rearrange scenes, how he might reframe a shot or adjust an actor's posture. Kim occasionally paused beside unfinished sets, thinking about the emotional tone they projected, imagining how Shin's eye would interpret them. Though he kept these thoughts private, he carried them with the quiet certainty of someone preparing for a collaboration that had yet to begin. Back in his quarters, Shin finally watched the tape he'd been holding for days. Not the state film shown during his meeting, but one of his own older works. Aides reported that he sat through it entirely, his posture tense at first, then gradually softening as he became absorbed in the familiar world of his own creation. When the film ended, he rewound it partway, rewatched a scene, then rewound again, analysing details with the precision of a man returning to the language he understood best. Kim received this update with a calm satisfaction that bordered on relief. He did not celebrate. He simply acknowledged the shift with the inward nod of someone who felt a long-awaited moment had finally arrived. He knew that once Shin fully reconnected with his creative identity, the question of "why am I here?" would slowly be replaced by "what can I do with what I have?" A transition Kim considered the true turning point in a story shaped by emotion, not force. That evening, Kim reviewed a list of potential film concepts he hoped to discuss with Shin at the appropriate time. Some were historical epics, others quiet dramas, all rooted in themes he believed would resonate with the director's strengths. Yet Kim understood that timing remained crucial. He did not intend to present these ideas until he sensed genuine readiness. For now, he simply allowed the space around Shin to remain steady and unpressured. As night settled over Pyongyang, Kim returned to his private screening room and selected a film he imagined Shin might one day remake. A story with emotional potential, but lacking the sophistication that Kim believed Shin could bring. He watched it slowly, scene by scene, imagining the adjustments Shin might suggest. And in that quiet room, filled only with the glow of the projector and the low hum of film reels spinning, Kim felt an emerging certainty. The next step would not be a meeting, nor a request, but an opening, an opportunity placed gently in front of Shin, allowing the director to decide in his own time whether to step into the world Kim had built for him. As the days passed, Kim Jong-il observed with quiet precision the gradual reawakening of the creative instincts he had been waiting for, sensing that Shin Sang-ok was beginning to shift from mere survival toward contemplation. The reports no longer described a man frozen by fear, but someone cautiously reconnecting with the world around him, noticing details he had previously ignored. The way light fell across the floor in his quarters, the distant sound of rehearsals somewhere beyond the compound, the quiet rustle of pages when aides brought notebooks. Kim believed these small signs meant Shin's inner world was realigning, not fully accepting his circumstances, but opening enough space for thought to move where instinct naturally guided it. To encourage this progression, Kim ordered a subtle change. A small stack of blank storyboards was placed near Shin's table, not accompanied by any instruction. Next to them, he had aides leave a single pencil, sharpened cleanly, positioned as if someone had just set it down. He knew an artist could ignore films, even avoid conversation, but the quiet potential of a blank storyboard often carried an irresistible pull. If Shin chose not to touch them, nothing would change, but if he did, Kim would recognize it as a signal louder than words. Meanwhile, Kim continued shaping the environment outside Shin's walls, reviewing early drafts of projects he hoped to present one day, adjusting concepts so they aligned with the director's strengths. He spent evenings walking through the studio corridors imagining how Shin might interpret the textures, the lighting, the emotional weight of the sets. He often paused at the entrance of the costume workshop, imagining how Shin's eye for detail would transform even the smallest scenes. Kim felt a kind of quiet anticipation building, the feeling a filmmaker experiences just before a complex scene comes together. In Shin's quarters, the shift came slowly. At first, he ignored the storyboards, though his gaze lingered on them when he thought no one noticed. Then one afternoon, an aide reported that the pencil had moved. No drawings, no notes, just the faintest sign that Shin had picked it up, held it, and set it back down. To anyone else it would have meant nothing, but to Kim it was the clearest sign yet that the director's mind was returning to the familiar structure of creation, even if only through instinctive habit. Kim received the update without outward reaction, but inside he felt the quiet confirmation he had been waiting for. The time for direct requests had still not arrived. He would not push. Instead, he chose a quieter gesture. He instructed an aide to deliver a single book to Shin's room, a worn, annotated text on film theory that Kim had personally spent years studying. He placed no message inside, no hint of its source, only the book itself, filled with notes that revealed a mind deeply engaged with cinema. Kim believed that recognizing those handwritten thoughts, simple underlines, marginal questions, reflections on scenes, might speak to Shin more deeply than any conversation. That evening, Kim returned to his usual screening room and watched a simple, emotionally driven film, imagining how Shin might rework its structure, tighten its pacing, or deepen the performances. He let the scenes wash over him silently, knowing that somewhere nearby, a director who had once shaped entire eras of South Korean cinema was now sitting with a book full of handwritten questions about the nature of storytelling. And as the projector clicked softly in the dim room, Kim felt that the distance between them, the emotional distance, not the physical, had grown just a little smaller. As the book of film theory remained in Shin Sang-ok's quarters, Kim Jong-il monitored every subtle development with the same patience he used when studying a slow, meditative scene unfolding on screen. Reports indicated that Shin had opened the book more than once, not reading for long stretches, but flipping to pages marked with handwritten notes, small markings, underlined lines, quick reflections about pacing, framing, or thematic contrast. These marginalia, written years earlier by Kim himself, created an unexpected bridge between them. Thoughts from one filmmaker quietly reaching another across an emotional distance shaped by fear, uncertainty, and reluctant curiosity. Kim believed this connection mattered. He did not expect Shin to agree with the annotations. He simply wanted him to recognise that the person who had brought him here did not see cinema as a superficial hobby, but as a language worth studying deeply. Meanwhile, Kim continued shaping the environment around Shin in subtle ways. A single reel of unedited test footage was delivered to a nearby storage room where Shin sometimes passed during brief, supervised walks. The reel was intentionally unlabelled except for a small handwritten note: lighting test, unfinished. Kim wanted Shin to understand that the world outside his quarters was not static but living, waiting for someone with vision to guide it. He refused to push. Instead, he allowed silence and space to do what speeches could not. A few days later, an aide quietly reported something Kim had been waiting for. Shin had asked, in a cautious, almost hesitant tone, where the film theory book had come from. No answer was given, exactly as Kim instructed. It wasn't the question itself that mattered. It was the willingness to voice it. The act of asking meant Shin was no longer completely closed off. He was looking outward again, trying to form a narrative around his situation. Kim saw this as a shift in emotional framing, the moment in a film when a character turns slightly toward the unknown rather than away from it. In the studios, Kim moved through the halls in the late evening, imagining how the next steps might unfold. He stopped briefly in the editing room, running his hand across the cold metal of the moviola, picturing Shin sitting there, adjusting cuts, rearranging scenes, breathing life into the footage with the instinctive precision Kim admired. He believed deeply that once Shin stepped into a creative space, even reluctantly, the emotional weight of his situation would begin to shift. Creation, Kim thought, had always been the director's anchor. If he could engage with it again, even through small gestures, fear would eventually lose its hold. That night, Kim made one more quiet decision. He ordered that a short selection of unused film stills, raw images without context, be placed on a table in the hallway Shin passed each afternoon. Not handed to him, not explained, simply placed where he might see them. The stills were intentionally imperfect. Actors mid-movement, uneven lighting, expressions that hinted at emotional depth but lacked clarity. Kim believed that such flaws, visible yet fixable, would spark the instinct to correct, to guide, to improve. As he reviewed the plan, Kim felt a sense of calm confidence, aware that each gesture, each subtle invitation, was slowly drawing Shin closer to the world that awaited him. He did not need the director to surrender. He needed him to feel the familiar pull of a life shaped by frames, stories, and the quiet desire to make something better than what existed before. And in that pull, Kim sensed the beginning of the transformation he had envisioned for years. As more days passed, the small, almost imperceptible shifts in Shin Sang-ok's behaviour formed a pattern Kim Jong-il recognised instantly. The pattern of someone whose mind was slowly turning toward purpose, even if he did not acknowledge it yet. Reports noted that Shin now paused longer at the film stills placed in the hallway, sometimes leaning closer as though examining the lighting or questioning the framing. He still avoided touching them, but the way he looked at the images had changed. It was no longer the glance of a man trying to avoid engagement, but the focus of a filmmaker seeing flaws, potential, and the quiet invitation to improve what he saw. Kim took these signs seriously. He believed that creativity, once awakened even slightly, spread naturally through the mind like a slow-moving light. He also understood that pushing too quickly could risk everything, so he continued with his gentle, deliberate strategy. letting silence and curiosity guide Shin more effectively than force ever could. Meanwhile, Kim spent his nights in the studios refining a small collection of scenes he hoped Shin might one day review. These were not full films, but fragments, short dramatic moments, incomplete sequences, tests of emotion where something didn't quite land. Kim imagined how Shin would respond to them, how he might adjust blocking, refine dialogue, or guide actors toward more nuanced expression. Kim's notes grew more detailed, less like the directives of a political leader, and more like the quiet self-critiques of a student preparing to learn from a master. Back in his quarters, Shin began pacing with a different rhythm, slower and more thoughtful, as though his mind were organising itself around a problem he had not yet defined. One afternoon, a small but telling moment occurred. He picked up one of the film stills from the hallway and held it for several seconds before returning it to its place. The gesture was simple, but to Kim it signalled something profound. Touching the still meant breaking distance, not physical distance, but emotional. It meant his instincts were beginning to outweigh his fear. When Kim received the update, he closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the significance of the moment like a director seeing the first perfect take of a difficult scene. He did not respond with excitement, only calm certainty. That evening, Kim instructed an aide to make one more subtle adjustment. A small portable camera, nothing elaborate but functional, was to be placed on a table near the area where Shin walked. No message, no instruction, no pressure. Kim believed that the presence of the camera alone, the familiar weight of the object, the potential it represented, would begin to stir something deeper within Shin. A camera, unlike film stills or theory books, was a tool, an invitation not just to analyse but to create. Kim knew Shin might ignore it at first, but he trusted time. Creativity, he believed, always reached for tools once they were placed within sight. As he made this decision, Kim felt the story nearing another quiet turning point. The transformation he envisioned would not come through grand gestures, but through these subtle, carefully placed opportunities that invited instinct to awaken on its own terms. And as night settled over Pyongyang, Kim allowed himself to imagine the moment when Shin would pick up the camera for the first time. Not to escape his circumstances, but to reconnect with the part of himself Kim had always believed would eventually lead him toward the future he had built in the shadows, frame by frame. In the days that followed, the presence of the camera on the table became the quiet centre of Shin Sang-ok's small world, a silent companion he tried at first to ignore but could not fully look away from. Aides reported that he walked past it slowly each afternoon, his gaze lingering just a moment longer each time, the hesitation in his step revealing more than words ever could. Kim Jong-il studied these updates with the patience of a director waiting for an actor to find the truth of a scene on their own, knowing that the moment Shin reached for the camera would not be an act of surrender, but a return to himself, a reclaiming of the only language he had ever truly lived by. Kim refused to rush the moment. He instructed his staff to leave everything exactly as it was. No new prompts, no attempts to coax a reaction. He knew that creativity could not be commanded. It had to surface silently, naturally, through the weight of inner need. And so he continued to shape the environment around the edges, refining the unseen scaffolding of the world he hoped Shin would soon step into. Meanwhile, something small shifted in Shin's behaviour. He no longer walked past the camera quickly. Instead, he slowed down near it, sometimes pausing just long enough for aides to notice a subtle tightening in his jaw, the kind that came when a person confronted a familiar tool they were not yet ready to touch. He did not pick it up, but the restraint itself was telling. It was the restraint of a filmmaker trying not to acknowledge the possibility of creation too soon. Kim received each report quietly, not with excitement, but with the deep, steady certainty of someone watching the final pieces of a long-crafted emotional structure fall into place. To him, this progression mirrored one of his favourite cinematic rhythms, tension held just long enough before the inevitable shift. In the studios, Kim continued to prepare for the future he envisioned. He oversaw small test shoots, observing how different lighting setups changed the emotional tone of a scene. He imagined how Shin would refine these choices, how he would guide actors toward more natural performances. Kim even practiced what he might say the first time he asked Shin for advice, not as a directive, but as a question posed by one student of cinema to another. That evening, an aide delivered a quiet update that made Kim pause. Shin had placed his hand on the camera, not lifting it, not fully grasping it, but resting his palm on it for several seconds before walking away. The gesture was small, but to Kim it was monumental. It meant the barrier was thinning, the emotional distance narrowing. Kim allowed himself one long, steady breath, recognizing the moment as the clearest sign yet that Shin's creative identity was resurfacing. That night, Kim returned to his screening room and watched one of his own unfinished projects, imagining how Shin might edit it, how he might adjust its rough edges. Kim did not see the scene as incomplete anymore. He saw it as waiting for the director he believed would one day step behind a North Korean camera, not because he was forced to, but because his instinct to create had grown stronger than the fear that once silenced it. As the film flickered softly against the screen, Kim felt the story he had shaped for years reaching its penultimate point. He did not celebrate. He simply understood. The moment Shin finally picked up the camera, a simple, quiet gesture, would not mark the end of Kim's plan, but the beginning of the future he had envisioned in the shadows. In the quiet morning that followed, when light settled gently across the floor of his small quarters, Shin Sang-ok finally reached for the camera, not tentatively, not with hesitation, but with the steady, instinctive motion of someone returning to a part of himself he could no longer deny. Aides reported that he lifted it slowly, turning it in his hands, running his thumb across the worn edges as though reacquainting himself with a familiar voice. He adjusted the lens, checked the weight, tested the focus ring, and then held it up briefly, as if framing a shot he could see only in his mind. He made no announcement, no declaration, but the act itself carried the undeniable gravity of a moment long in the making. When Kim Jong-il received the update, he did not stand or smile or reveal any outward sign of excitement. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief moment and allowed a deep sense of certainty to settle through him, the kind that comes when a vision nurtured for years finally aligns with reality. To Kim, Shin lifting the camera was not an act of surrender, but of emergence, a return to identity, a quiet acceptance of the creative instinct that had always defined him. Kim did not summon Shin immediately. He refused to disrupt the fragile, newly awakened momentum. Instead, he instructed aides to provide him with film stock, a tripod, and a small light. Nothing elaborate, nothing overwhelming, just tools, the raw materials of imagination. Later that afternoon, Shin began taking small steps around his quarters, lifting the camera to his eye, adjusting angles, experimenting with movement. He recorded nothing, but the gestures were unmistakable. He was thinking like a director again. Kim watched from afar, receiving each update with the calm focus of someone observing the final shot of a long, deliberate sequence. In the following days, Shin asked a few quiet questions about equipment, about the type of film stock available, about whether there were studios nearby. His voice was cautious, but the curiosity within it was unmistakable. Kim instructed aides to respond simply, offering basic information without pressure. He understood that each question marked a shift, each word a step toward the world he had built. When the time finally felt right, Kim arranged their third meeting. As before, the room was simple, quiet, gently lit. But this time, Kim did not bring a film reel or a theoretical text. Instead, he placed the camera Shin had held on the table between them, along with a single strip of undeveloped film. Shin sat across from him, unspeaking, but with a steady focus Kim had not seen before. Kim told him softly that North Korea had studios, actors, scripts, resources waiting for someone with vision. He did not ask for loyalty or obedience, only perspective. He spoke of potential, of possibility, of the chance to shape something new, something that could elevate the entire nation's artistic voice. Shin did not answer immediately, but he did not look away. When the meeting ended, he took the camera with him. For Kim, that gesture was enough. In the months that followed, Shin would begin working quietly within the walls of the studio complex, contributing ideas, refining scenes, and slowly reclaiming the role that had once defined his life. Kim oversaw these early steps with a silent, watchful pride, not triumphant, but deeply assured. He believed he had fulfilled a destiny shaped not by power alone, but by the quiet certainty that cinema, its language, its rhythm, its emotion, could bring together two lives in ways politics never could. And though the world outside would never know the full story, inside Pyongyang's dimly lit studios, Kim Jong-il saw the future he had dreamed of slowly taking form, frame by frame, under the steady hands of the director he had waited for all his life.